Of marriage, the biblical foundation of marriage. And that includes not only the husband and wife, but that also includes children. And it is a challenge to raise children. Always has been. It's always been a challenge. But today, it is even a greater challenge today than it has been in the last number of decades. Just unbelievable what young people are involved in and getting into that can be very problematic. Part of the issue, as we've pointed out already, is the divided or broken home, divorce. And children are then pulled between two different parents in two different directions. And for many cases, they even are left on their own much of the time because their parents have gone separate ways in their lives, moved to different cities and so on. And as a result, many things transpires with children. And parents generally, even those who are still together these days, they become pretty permissive in what they lay down for children. And often children pretty much rule the house, often in many cases, because there's no parent or parents that are taking the bull by the horns, as they say, and laying principles out for them to follow. Parents, as we've already indicated, are too permissive with their young people. We recognize that this is a pendulum that can swing both ways. But the overly protective, strict parents are the minority. They're the ones that are few and far between today. And that has its problems as well. If you're too controlling of your children. The majority of parents are too permissive. And they are the cause of the greatest problems. Most parents don't know where their children are, with whom they are, or even when they will be home. Teenagers are allowed to make their own rules. As a pastor, I've seen that in families. I've seen children who basically control the household. And mom and dad are afraid that they're going to lose their children, afraid that they're going to lose what little tiny bit of control they do have. And so they have a tendency to back off on everything. Whatever little Junior wants or little Susie wants, well, that's what they get, oftentimes. It is sad to see a situation where moms and dads can't agree on principles. And again, principles is the key here that operate the household. Everybody's in this for themselves. And children are finding that they don't have any real anchor to hold on to. One of the characteristics of children is that they're learning. They begin learning at the moment they are born. They're in a whole new environment with birth. And they don't know what to do with this. And they begin to learn. And oftentimes they're learning things they should not be learning. And it causes problems of enormous nature as the years go by. Having guidelines in the home is extremely important if you're going to have children that are going to grow up right. And sadly, parents are occupied with two different careers and have very little time with their children. The children are still going to grow up. It's that they don't get their education primarily in the home. They get it in the public school system, and they get it on the streets. And when you begin to look at what they're being taught in schools, you begin to wonder, how can anybody function? For example, a principle that was taught when I was in a secular college. I Had a professor stood before the class and said, society makes the determination of what right and wrong is. Society does. There are many cultures within major cultures that make up their own rules, the way everything is supposed to be. And that's the way they live. And when it crosses cultures, it becomes a conflict. And you have children growing up in small cultures called the gang. You know, those who rule the neighborhood. Why? Because there are no moms and dads there to rule. There may be a mom here and there in the neighborhood, but they're not doing a whole lot of ruling, and even if they wanted to, they probably would not be able to do that effectively. Well, there are no laws or rules to be followed, but there are principles, this is an important word, to be adhered to. Each family's needs are different. Each family must seek the Lord for wisdom to enact the principles in their own home and family. But as long as a child lives under the parents' roof, the parents are responsible to set guidelines. Principles. There are two fundamental ways, as indicated, that we can live under: law or principles. Law and principles are different. Law simply states what you can do and what you cannot do. Law is inflexible. Inflexible. And we all know that the more people you have in a household, the more people you have in the family, everybody's got an opinion and everybody's got a view. They're all different, they're all separate, and they have this. They make their decisions. And that comes in conflict. But law doesn't consider that there are variations that they need to be accounted for. It's cut, it's dried. The law says you do this, the law says you don't do that. There is no variations. Otherwise, it would not be the law. Very quickly, the Hebrew people living under the law learned that it is very strict, it is unforgiving, it doesn't take in consideration a multitude of variations that come when you have a multitude of people. And it is final. Law is. Now, principles. Principles try to do and succeed where law fails. And the fact that principles take a principle. For example, not to steal. The law says, thou shalt not steal. And that's just the way that it is. A principle is that we're not going to steal. But here's an example. Somebody is in the store shopping. And maybe they decide to light up a cigarette in the store, even though the law says you should not do that. You can't do that, not in a public place. But they light the cigarette up anyway. All of a sudden, their clothing catches on fire from the cigarette. The person in the fire is spreading rapidly. And somebody grabs a fire extinguisher in the hardware department and chases this person down and puts out the fire. Under the law, that person actually stole the fire extinguisher. They didn't pay for it. They didn't ask if they could take it. They took it to save a life. With a principle, the variation is forgiving for something like that. Under the principle, we're not to steal. We should not steal. But sometimes this happens, as the illustration that we used did. It happens. But it's hard today for families to even begin to understand about principles and law and how to establish and set up a home so that you can operate under, and there can be variations. They will set hard, fast times. For example, mom and dad says to the child, the teenager, curfew is 10 o'clock. We expect you home here at 10 o'clock. Not a second past 10, at 10. We expect you to be here. Well, at 9:45, that teenager looks at the watch and says, well, I'm going to have to be getting home. But wherever they're at, that their parent doesn't even know where they're at, as we've already pointed out, in many cases happens. Where are your children? I don't know. They're old enough to know what to do, blah, blah, blah. Well, parents don't know where they're at, but the child knows got to be home at 10. And so that's how it starts making its way to home. But it didn't take into consideration that from where they were originally to where they have gone to now, they didn't take into consideration how much time it took to get to that place that they were at when they realized they got 15 minutes to get back. And it takes 20 minutes to get back. They're 5 minutes late. Mom and dad just explode because they were 5 minutes late. Now, little Junior, little Susie made a, try to push the envelope. See how far we can go past and get away with it. And so the parents have a tendency to be harsh on that. But there needs to be this whole concept that we need to have this principle. And keep in mind the principle. 10 o'clock is the goal. We don't expect you to be 20 miles down the road and it's 10 minutes till, and you're going to drive at 65 miles and down a 35-mile-an-hour zone to get home at 10. That's not the idea. Teaching them the responsibility to get home at the time. And then the principle is flexible to some extent. Instead of saying 10 o'clock, 1 second past 10, you broke your curfew time. 10 o'clock. Sometimes they may come home 5 minutes to 10. Other times they may not get home till 10 after 10. But they still are running in that area of the 10 o'clock hour. Need to talk about being more precise. But then there are things that do come up. There could have been a traffic accident. And the streets were blocked. And so that takes more time than you anticipated and planned, and so on. But it gives leeway. It is not the stringency of the law, but is not flexible. The law doesn't bend. The law doesn't move. Exactly what the law says is exactly what it is. So we need to be operating under principles. Families need to realize there's difference in family needs. They need to seek the Lord for wisdom to enact principles in their own home and family. And these are very, very important. Parents are responsible for their children as long as they live under their roof. And when they reach a certain age in their maturity, as they grow and get out on their own, they graduate from high school, they go to college, they get a job, so on. These things need to be understood. They may still be living at home, therefore they're under mom and dad's authority, and they should respect that authority and live by those rules. If they don't like the rules, move out. Get your own house, your own apartment, your own transportation. Do all that yourself. Sometimes it's hard for them to do that. But you can ease up on all of the principles and let them make their own decision as they grow in their maturity. Maturity is the important factor. Here are some of the mistakes that teens make. A, teens often look up to the wrong heroes. Sports figures, entertainment figures. Just to give you some examples. The movie and TV industries are largely responsible for the moral decay in our society today. These industries portray adulterers, fornicators, harlots as heroes and heroines of the movies and TV. When a Christian is portrayed, he or she is seen as a hypocritical, Bible-spouting, crazed wacko. Yeah, that's what they look at us as. We're that kind of individual. That's the way they think of us. That's the way we're oftentimes being portrayed. But these are mistakes that are being made by teens. They look at us that way. They see things like this. And it is something that is very important that we instill biblical principles in their lives. B, teenagers have adopted the now philosophy. They cannot seem to think of the future. They think of everything as right now, today. Go for all the gusto. Little thought is given to the fact that many of the choices the teens make now will affect him or her for the remainder of their life. When you look at some of the things that are going on that are popular today, that are considered normal today. Sex outside of marriage often ends in pregnancy outside of marriage. And people think today that that's no real big deal. One of the solutions is abort the baby. That doesn't solve anything. That only complicates it even more. And others say, well, that's okay, we'll just get married. That doesn't work either. Because the situation is forced, or at least implied force. We have to get married. Pressure from the family or families. That doesn't solve the problem. A situation has been created that there is no opportunity or ability to get beyond the circumstances of that. Here is a life. Let's start with the baby. This baby didn't ask to be conceived. It didn't have any vote in the matter, didn't have a voice in the matter. It was conceived out of wedlock. Mom and dad didn't necessarily love each other. They just had a good time together, and as a result, the child was conceived. Immediately, the discussion is, what are we going to do? And a popular answer today is abort the baby. After all, we don't know anything about the baby. And often it has been described as little more than a tissue of the mother, which is incorrect. And all of this becomes complicating the whole matter even more. The baby is aborted. I wonder what that baby, if permitted to have grown, and grew up in a family that loved mom and dad, that loved each other, and loved their baby. Could that person been the person who found the universal cure for cancer? Doesn't make any difference what kind of cancer it is, or even in what stage it's in. But they discover a medicine, and the right combination and compound becomes the solution that kills the cancer cells, stops it dead. But that baby was aborted. So you see some problems right there, don't we? What could that child have become? Well, maybe it come out because of the situation. Mom and dad didn't really want the child. They're not married, and they're thinking about their own possible careers in the future, college you're going to go to, what's mom and dad at home going to think about the pregnancy, so on and so forth. Let's just get rid of the problem. Abort the baby. Now let's think of the mother. Now, we've heard the testimonies of some mothers who said that the abortion, getting rid of the baby, or even giving birth to it and putting it up for adoption. The mother feels guilt. And that guilt becomes very prominent on the anniversary that would have been the birthday of that child, year after year after year. The best they can do is learn to cope with it. Tragically, there are some mothers who committed suicide because they couldn't cope with it. Well, let's look at the father now. He doesn't get away with this either. He deals with it in the back of his mind. He deals with it there. Man, that's a hard thing. He gets on drugs, alcohol, just trying to cope with life in general and the fact that we had a baby that we either gave away or aborted. Or there's yet the other option. The baby is kept. The baby is kept. And generally the mother will keep the child. And the father basically may, if they have the ability, send a few dollars their way and that sort of thing. But generally that doesn't happen too much. Here you have a child that doesn't grow up with a mom and dad. Has a mother, but mom also is now having to work, and the baby is in daycare. The child grows up in daycare until it gets old enough that it, can function somewhat on its own. But then it starts seeking the answers to life. Where do we go on this? How do we deal with these things? Well, it becomes street knowledge. And the public education. And all these things work very negative on that child. Gangs begin to develop. And these gangs develop because each one of these children are, well, an accident of life. They're here because of an accident of life. No mom, no dad. They need to fit in. They need to have some family that they can trust, that they can adhere to, that has some kind of form of order and rule. And we know what that can engender, too. Tragedy. Some years ago, I talked with a teenage girl who was a junior higher at the time. And the cool thing that she said to me was that was going on in junior high. It was cool for the girls to be pregnant and not married. That was considered cool. Immediately you see a problem, don't you? That's a culture that has fallen apart. Some months later, that same young lady that I was talking to had told me about that. She was now pregnant, out of wedlock. Then there is other dynamics to this. And this used to be fairly common in situations because society said, if a man impregnates a girl, a woman, he is to marry her. Society expected that. There's no other alternative. Well, that has its own problems that are built right in. Even if it was somewhat of a love relationship that they had, now it has been so complicated that love is out the window. It's an endurance contest in many cases. But there were some that had a tendency to say they made this thing work and work well. Some years ago, I got a phone call. On the other end of the line was a woman, middle-aged woman. And she said, I got a problem, and I need to come and talk to you about it. Okay. So she came and she sat down, and in tears she said, my husband doesn't love me. And I said, how did you come to that conclusion? Did he do something? Thought do something? Did he say something? What happened? What happened? Well, she said, he just doesn't love me. I don't know what happened. And so we had several sessions together, and among the things that I asked her about was the family, children. And they had several children. And I picked up on something fairly quickly because I asked the age of the children. And she started with the oldest. And immediately when she started with the oldest, I see a problem. I knew because she had already shared with me how long that they had been married, 20 years. And their oldest child was 21. You do see the problem. Yeah. Well, as we chased this down over the course of time, discussing various things, and finally getting the husband to come in and sit down along with the wife, and he said, I don't know where my wife gets this idea I don't love her. I do love her. And in the conversation, it all came out. They had a child out of wedlock, and they were pressured to get married. And even though they had adopted to the situation or adapted to the situation, and even though they had actually entered into a love relationship, in the back of the mind, the wife wondered, does he really love me, or did he marry me because he felt that he had to? I simply share all that to say the complications that arise when we get out of biblical principles and when we start relying on the ways of the world to establish our lives as individuals and as a family and for our children. It creates things that you can't back up and change. They eventually cope somehow. But coping is never solving the problem. It's a problem that is unsolved. They just adapt to the fact that it's unsolvable and make the best that we can of it. And that's not a good way to go. And when the culture becomes like American culture today, where society determines what is right and what is wrong, and everybody's got an opinion. They're like noses. Everybody's got one. An opinion. Crazy. We need to understand there are certain principles, biblical principles, that we must not compromise. Children must be taught there are certain things that you do that you could never retract. You can't take the toothpaste and put it back in the tube.